Mark, what I'm hearing is that uh, if the judge does not let Diddy out on bail, Donald Trump will immediately review his file to determine if a pardon is appropriate. And if he does grant bail, if the judge grants bail, that Trump would wait until sentencing and then make a determination. Do I have it right or not?
Well, I've heard the very same things. One of the things I'm fascinated by here, how's this for a segue, is the motion under Rule 29 that was filed. And for those who don't know, that's in federal court, in the criminal court. Rule 29 is the motion for acquittal. And it's fascinating because the only two counts that survived are the so-called Mann Act counts that you and I have talked about. And you know who we have waiting in the wings here, Harvey?
I do. I'm excited.
Right?
I,
We've got I would call her appellate royalty. I mean, she has, I think in the last 3 weeks, maybe in the last month, I was teasing her earlier. I get kind of these breaking news alerts when there's a reversal of a criminal case. She's had two in the Second Circuit in the last month, which is unbelievable. I know appellate lawyers who go a whole career and don't get two in the Second Circuit. So, and she's also representing some others that you know of. And why don't you introduce her
it's
and bring
Alexandra
her on?
Shapiro. She is a legend in the appellate industry, let's call it. And she is involved in this case as well. Alexandra, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I was fascinated by this. I read the legal docs on it. Is that I cannot imagine that this judge, the trial judge, is going to throw out this conviction. It just seemed to me this is more for the appeal than it is the current sentencing.
Well, I don't agree with that, of course, because, we hope that the judge will take the motion as seriously as he should. We think it's a very strong motion and that we've made a really strong case that these Mann Act counts, which are incredibly unusual, even notwithstanding the sordid history of the Mann Act, which is a very notoriously terrible statute. So, of course, if we lose and the client decides to appeal, we're ready for that. But we certainly hope that we've got a good shot at winning the motion as well.
So, Alexandra, for those who aren't in the weeds, the Mann Act, as you talked about kind of the sordid history of it, it was originally called the White Slavery Act and famously was used, I think, against Jack Johnson, the former heavyweight champion, over 100 years ago, and then was renamed at one point, and I forget the year, after a senator whose name was Mann. It isn't named after M-A-N, it's named after a senator whose last name was M-A-N-N. And I think in the Rule 29, as I remember, there have been so many flurries of motions and I've read so much stuff, there's been kind of an analysis of the application of it. Can you describe that?
Yeah, sure. So it was originally enacted in the early 1900s, and it was, as you said, called the White Slave Traffic Act. And the impetus for it was this kind of hysteria over what was probably almost certainly fake news, which was this idea that people thought all these white women were being coerced into prostitution. And that was the impetus for it. And when it was originally enacted, though, it was supposed to be used for commercial people who made money off women who were exploited in this way. And then, but it was written a lot more broadly. And so shortly after it got enacted, prosecutors started using it selectively, especially to go after Black men. And as you said, famously, Jack Johnson was one example of that.
And Chuck
And
Berry.
Chuck Berry as well, right?
He's
As I
another
remember.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And and there were some important U.S. Supreme Court cases in the early days of the act and in the first half of the 20th century where the U.S. Supreme Court held that it actually didn't apply just to commercial purveyors of prostitution. And they went so far in this case called Cleveland, even more heinously to sort of, it was a case involving Mormon polygamists, and they went off on this whole tangent about the morality of the Mormon religion and how they weren't good Christians. And so that's kind of the history we're dealing with. And it wasn't until the 1980s that the statute actually got amended. And at that time, they changed the language to gender neutral so that the quote unquote prostitute could be either a man or a woman. And they got rid of this vague language that had been in the statute about morality and debauchery, believe it or not, which was used in part by the Supreme Court in these cases. But they replaced it with something that, I think is still pretty vague, which is that basically if you transport someone across state lines with the purpose of having them engage in any sexual activity for which any person can be charged with a criminal offense, that's a violation. And obviously, there are many, many different sex crimes in different states and localities. And even to this day, there are probably statutes on the books that we would all think were unconstitutional, prohibiting certain types of sexual activity between consenting adults even. So it's still a pretty vague statute in many ways, but that's
kind of a couple of examples. If this case had been brought in the 70s, you could not bring it basically, because in this case, when I say Diddy's case, it's males who are being transported, right?
Exactly right. It wasn't until 1986 that it was amended to say person instead of a woman or girl, I think was the language.
So, as you argue that the Mann Act is outdated, ill-conceived, and they should throw the conviction out because of that, prosecutors are saying in their latest papers that were filed late last night that not only should the judge throw the book at him and give him the 5 years that they had initially asked for, now they're suggesting they may go for more than 5 years to go after Diddy. So, you're arguing this is an ill-conceived act. They're saying not only is it fair game and did the jury convict, but we want above what we had even asked for initially because we think what he did is so heinous.
But that was in response to the bail,
right.
Not to the.
Oh no, I understand,
right. But yeah, my reaction. I don't know if Alexandra wants to engage on this. My reaction is, what a bunch of sore losers. They threw everything at Sean Combs. They tried to not only take his life, they tried to take his fortune, his net worth. They've taken his freedom, everything. He rolled the dice and he beat him. He didn't even, and I know I had said this before, people said misconstrued it. He didn't even put on a defense. He did not put on a defense. He took the prosecutor's case and said to the jury, here you go. And they failed miserably. In 8th grade, we would have said, what about sore losers? Sorry, Alexandra. That question was for you. I had to get it off.
No, it was for both of you.
Yeah, I don't want to comment on the bail issue, which is pending. But what I'll say is this: I think that these types of arguments, and they're arguments they may well make at sentencing, they do basically ignore the verdict. The verdict was very clear. The jury resoundingly rejected the argument that there was any force, fraud, or coercion on these women who the government said were victims of sex trafficking. The jury said no, that they weren't. They rejected that. And now what we have left of the case is 2 convictions for transporting people across state lines supposedly for the purpose of prostitution. That's what's left.
And by the way, I've said this before. I'll say it again. It drives me crazy. We're as we're taping this, it's a Friday. So by the time this drops, it'll be Saturday. I can't tell you the number of times that I have gone to Burbank Airport and sat at the Southwest Terminal years ago to go to Vegas on a Friday afternoon. And if you take a look at that Southwest Terminal, if you don't think that the majority of people who are there are going to Vegas to have sex and may have somebody that they are transporting with them who may have that in their mind, you're naive is all I'll say. So it reminds me of what the former head of the Ninth Circuit, the judge who retired, once said, if you let any federal prosecutor pick anybody walking around and give them enough time, they'll find 3 federal violations. So whether it's on the books or not, and whether it's being applied appropriately or not, it's just, to me, outrageous that they lost so spectacularly, and Alexandra's not going to want to go here. But then they do this stuff where they redact in their filings, stuff where they're trying to put in front of the judge again, the stuff that wasn't in front of the jury. Obviously, that's why it's redacted, and just trying to throw more stuff against the wall. And by the way, one of the reasons this is so predictable, one of the reasons they up their ask, so to speak, is it's this negotiating standpoint that they reflexively engage in as a prosecutor. If I ask for something outrageous, 10 years or something like that, maybe the natural inclination is somebody's going to do the Solomonic, cut it in half, and just give what I really want. I mean, it's just juvenile. It doesn't comport with the sentencing guidelines, and it's aggravating. Sorry, Alexandra.
No, that's true. That's definitely the MO in general of these prosecutors and the prosecutors in general. I once had a case many years ago that I did the appeal for where it was a huge tax fraud case, and the government seriously went in and told the judge that the defendant should get a 25-year sentence. And, the judge said, who was a pretty harsh sentencer generally, said to them, that's the sentence for murder in New York State. Are you serious? But that's what they were doing because they figured, oh, then maybe we have a shot at getting 10 years if we ask for 25.
So,
Yeah.
so look, we're
And
talking.
by the way, Alexandra, you're an ex-AUSA, correct?
What's that?
You're an ex-prosecutor. You're a recovering
I am.
prosecutor, yes.
Yeah, some people find that hard to believe, but it's true.
No, I don't. So look, we're talking about, will the judge throw out the Mann Act entirely? Would they do that on appeal? What's the sentence? I've got a really strong feeling that Donald Trump is going to seriously consider pardoning Diddy for a couple of reasons. 2 really. One is that they were both prosecuted by the Southern District of New York. They both said it was a targeted prosecution. And Donald Trump feels what Diddy says he went through. And there's that connection. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, Donald Trump has not been able to figure out anything to divert people from Epstein. And, he has tried with Obama, he's tried with Putin, he has tried everything under the sun, and it hasn't worked. And I just can't help but think that if Donald Trump pardons Diddy, whether you think he should or not, he can do things not necessarily because he wants to pardon Diddy, but it is the best way that he can think of to divert attention away from Epstein. And I think if he pardoned Diddy, people would go crazy, and I think he'd like that at this point.
You
I think
want
I'll
me?
leave that with Mark.
Yeah, I was going to say, let me jump in on that for a couple. First of all, I honestly think, remember, he was asked the question famously back in May. Back in May, when this trial just started, I can picture it in my mind. He was asked by a reporter, I believe while he was sitting behind the Resolute desk, And he said, I'll consider it. I'll look at it. You know, we used to be close, or we used to at least talk. And that was when Sean was accused of 2 counts of the sex trafficking, accused of the RICO. I mean, I thought that was, give him his due. I thought that was, instead of saying no, never in a million years, he said, I would consider it. That was then. Now look where we are. To your point, Harvey, if I'm Donald Trump, if I've been through the Manhattan DA prosecution, I've been through the New York Attorney General prosecution, I've been through the most ridiculous Georgia prosecution, I've been through all of those things, and I see somebody that I used to know, Sean Combs, who actually we got along famously until Donald Trump entered politics, which is a story that is often told by him. And I see that he rolled the dice, that he didn't kind of fold. And it's in New York, and there are so many similarities. I didn't even mention the E. Jean Carroll verdict. There's so many similarities. How could that not resonate with him? That here's somebody who's been through what I went through, and I feel for him. And by the way, I do have the pardon power, and part of the pardon power is if I see an inequity, why wouldn't I do it? Now, factor in what you said. You call it a diversion from Epstein. I actually take the position that this prosecution by the DOJ, which started not under Trump's DOJ, but under the previous administration, I always thought that this was a proxy for Epstein. That you know, Epstein died. We convicted Maxwell. We didn't get that much traction. It was kind of this unsatisfying result. We're going to go after Sean Combs. Remember, in the run-up to this case, we had Tenney on back in March. Tenney kept saying, trying to debunk everything that at that point was urban legend. There were minors. There were celebrity tapes. Everything you heard about Epstein was out there, and everybody believed, as recently as March of this year, was the same thing with Diddy. Then fast forward to the trial. By the way, Alexandra, how many celebrity tapes were there?
0.
How many minors were there?
0.
Yeah. And how many?
By the way, we talked about that. We knew that.
Yeah. Well, you did.
You did, but America didn't. I mean, my own children, when I told them I was getting involved in this case, they're like, what about Justin Bieber, etc. And I kept telling them this is all BS. This is all nonsense. And now, finally, I think most of America understands that, but we had to have a trial, a 2-month trial before the world understood that, I think.
Alexandra, I'm curious what your sense is of Trump pardoning Diddy.
I defer to Mark on that one. I'm not going to answer
that. She can't jump into the middle of that.
No, I mean, it's everybody's got an opinion about this.
Well, I don't think she would disagree with me that he should. I think anybody who's close to this case, I'll go out on a limb. Anybody who's close to this case understands the fact that he's still in custody, which is inexplicable to me in terms of having rolled the dice. I get what the argument was by the prosecution. I get what the judge said initially when this was first raised. But when you stand back and when you look at, and this is where I want to come back to Alexandra. Alexandra, I believe in one of the motions, in response, they can't point to, in fact, the government filed something, I was looking for it. They can't point to anybody similarly situated who's ever been prosecuted who's in custody for this kind of application. Am I right, or am I overstating that?
Two.
I think that there isn't anyone in custody in the unique circumstances of this case. I think that's right. I mean, there are people who've done prison time for the Mann Act. We found some other cases in which Johns were prosecuted and did prison time, but those were very different cases. The defendants in those cases, one was a police officer, one was a state court judge. And what's even worse is that in that case, the women who were the prostitutes were coerced into prostitution by a defendant in a related case. They were illegal immigrants who barely spoke English, who had basically been tricked into working as prostitutes. So that's the only kind of modern case even involving a
Well,
John.
they cited two cases in their papers they filed last night, in which people were prosecuted under the Mann Act, and the judge held them without bail pending sentencing. So they cited two. Both were federal district courts, no appeals courts, but they did cite two.
But remember, then nobody can point to a case. Remember, this is what they're doing. People forget about this. The people who are the supposed victims, do you understand? The people who are being transported are males who, if you watch any of their interviews, you've interviewed one of the so-called victims, Harvey.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember?
Yep.
That's who they say they're protecting. The law was not designed to be applied as to male escorts. I mean, that was never anybody's intent. That adult males who are crossing the line, the adult males have said that they're not victims.
So,
except for the one guy who's suing.
Alexandra,
and just to be clear, we're going to do another filing in a day or so, and we'll distinguish those cases. And I just don't want to preempt that. So,
and by the way, that's
why
they're
very different.
Yeah, they're not even in the same universe, but I'll leave that to her filing.
So, Alexandra, there was a judge, a justice of the Supreme Court, one of the worst ever. He wasn't a real smart guy. His name was McReynolds. But I've never forgotten this from law school. He wrote this. He wrote, if I can remember it, an amorphous dummy unspotted by human emotion is an unbecoming receptacle for judicial power. And what he was saying, which I thought was so smart, was that you don't want a judge who is devoid of human emotion, who doesn't have humanity in him in applying the rule of law. And so it kind of brings me to what the public thinks, because if you look at the public polling, because I've raised the points you guys are raising, they don't care. They see Diddy as a violent man. They see the 2016 Intercontinental Hotel. They hear the testimony of Cassie and Jane that they say was never rebutted, even though you clearly didn't have to rebut it. But they say all of those things. And we've taken polls numerous times, and 80% of the people say, lock him up. So why are you at all concerned if you make a solid legal argument that you are not going to have one of these amorphous dummies reviewing it, and that the humanity in them gets so angry that they say, screw the law, we're going to affirm the conviction?
God, can I jump in and save her from having to
Why?
have you compare
Why was
the
that
judge
bad?
in this case to an amorphous dummy?
No. It's the opposite. I'm not saying the judge isn't. I'm saying that what McReynolds said was it was an attribute to have that human emotion. That's all I'm saying. No, I'm not comparing any judge here. I'm saying that if you have that attribute of human emotion and humanity that you use to apply the law, Diddy may be behind the eight ball because of it, because of the things we've seen. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree with that. And I think, if anything, that you want a judge, and I think our judge is a great judge, very thoughtful and intelligent, fair minded. The person also has to consider the humanity of Sean Combs and what Sean Combs has been dragged through this process. Of course, he did some bad things. We owned up to all of that during the trial. The Cassie video was 9 years ago. And I think the judge is going to apply the law when he reviews the motion. If we get to sentencing, he's going to think about every aspect of the man, Sean Combs, in the appropriate way. And I haven't seen the polls you're talking about, but the numbers sound a little too high to me, given just what we've seen on social media from the people who came to watch the trial every day in the courtroom, in the overflow room, who were on his side in the case. And I think
Yeah,
our jurors were inside the courtroom, and they didn't just read about the testimony in the media. They actually heard the testimony. They saw all the text messages, including the ones that were under seal. They saw the videos that the public didn't get to see, and they made their own judgments about whether the women chose to be in these relationships and engaged in the activity that took place. And I think they were a very fair-minded jury, very diverse, came from all different sections of the community. And I think the judge is going to be fair-minded, as he has been throughout the process.
and I would echo that, and I'd also say, Harvey, one of the problems with your polls, and I know this from other clients that we've talked about, is they're unscientific.
Right.
You're doing one of those, and you would agree with that. You've
Yeah.
said that to me. They're not scientific polls. They're kind of rabble rousers who are online.
Well, there are 100,000 people who vote.
Yeah, but you can get 100,000 people to vote on anything any way you want online. People get them fired up. I mean, they're not scientific polls. The fact remains, I think Alexandra makes a great point. There were people who were seated on that jury who came in and were very honest about the fact that they came in with a presumption of guilt. And they said, okay, we'll try to do what jurors do. We'll try to set it aside. They were very frank about that. And once they saw what the evidence was, I mean, it was a resounding rebuke to the prosecution for a tremendous overreach. And I'll just keep coming back to it. Sore losers. I mean, Alexandra doesn't want to say that. I'll say it. They're sore losers. There is no way. It's outrageous to me that this case is being prosecuted by the civil rights section of the previous administration. It makes a mockery of the civil rights section. And I'm a guy who has spent, 40 some odd years fighting for civil rights. But the idea that this is a civil rights prosecution and your victims are escorts from Cowboys for Angels is it's really a bridge too far.
Alexandra, I was stunned, and I didn't realize this until recently, that the Mann Act, when you read that law, they call it a violent act of transporting a prostitute, that somehow it's inherently a violent act. And I'm wondering, are you going to attack that? Because I never understood that. I mean, you transport a prostitute across state lines. That doesn't make it a violent act, yet it's defined that way. So the whole structure of it seems weird to me.
It's strange. So the statute that he was convicted of doesn't actually use the word violence at all, or say that it's violent. There's another statute, another statute for purposes that's part of the bail statute that says a crime
right.
of violence is defined in a certain way, and it includes basically all the sections in the chapter of the United States Code that our little section is part of. And when we looked at the legislative history, what we found was, I think that was actually a mistake. And I think what Congress was focused on was that there's some other statutes in there that do require violence. And there's also a similar statute that involves minors. And they wanted to make sure in particular that the similar statute involving transporting minors was considered a crime of violence for purposes of the bail statute. So unfortunately, we're sort of stuck with that, and that's why the judge has to determine there are exceptional circumstances for bail. But this, other than that, in terms of the conviction itself, we don't have to worry about that, and there's no requirement that any violence be proven, and it's not really a violent crime if it involves the facts, that we have here.
When you're kind of looking at what the judge is going to do here, it seems like when he denied Diddy bail, Part of it had to do with what the prosecution said, and it seemed like the judge embraced, was a violent history, because he's not a flight risk. And so the violence part that the prosecution really pushed, even though it wasn't part of the Mann Act conviction, it seemed to resonate with the judge.
Well, I think what I'll say is this, when we put in the recent bail motion, as we explained, there isn't any recent violence, and they've now put in that opposition. We're going to put in another reply, and I really can't say anything more about it at the moment.
Yeah. And we'll bring her back after the ruling. How's that, Harvey?
Well, I think after this ruling, a lot is going to happen. I mean, that ruling is going to trigger a lot. And can I tell you something else that my office is talking about? There are a lot of people in my office who are saying, "Why is he asking for bail now?" Because if the judge, October is just a couple of months away now, and if the judge gives him, a year and 4 months, he's going to be out permanently in a much shorter period of time that if he gets out and goes back in. And it's kind of conceding, I suppose, that you can't just get the whole thing thrown out now. But if he wants to get out, to me, it's emotionally harder to get out and go back in than just tough it out for a couple of months and hope that the sentence is short enough that he'll be out permanently quickly.
Let me give you an example of that. I've had clients who are in custody for traffic violations who have told me while in custody through the bars, I will plead to a strike, just let me out. Nobody, and he's in one of the reputed worst places to be housed anywhere. So anybody who asks you that question is obviously either not in custody or has never been in custody. And let's leave it at that. I've already.
Well, I agree with you on that. I was just surprised a lot of people in my office.
It's because they haven't been in custody.
Right, right.
It's a very easy question to ask when you haven't done hard time.
God, Alexandra, it's so nice having you on. I know who you are and followed you, and I'm really thrilled you came on with us.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. It's been great.
I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Mark, we're going to have a lot to talk about next week.
Oh, you're not kidding.
A lot is going to happen. And just real quick, Menendez is this month.
Oh, yeah. As this drops, less than 3 weeks from the hearing, and probably about the same amount of time before the prosecutor gets to, as I say, reply to the order to show cause on the habeas, and maybe a month until Governor Newsom steps in.
Okay, so can I tell you one final thing my office is saying?
Yes.
They think if Donald Trump pardons Diddy, it's going to be harder for Newsom to grant the Menendez brothers clemency